You sit in the same room with elders and deacons, and you love them dearly. You appreciate them. And so you spend time talking about what's going on at church and what needs to go on, what's going to happen. And we were talking about Brother Adriano this evening and his plans and his work. And I won't tell you which deacon, but it's probably the one that leads singing, made the statement, can we send Paul? I love him anyway. Oh, yes. Is that what it was? Yeah. Keep digging that hole, brother. Oh man, but yes, no, I do love Steve and George and Jay and appreciate them very much. So, and it is good that we can sit and laugh in the midst of discussions. I think it's important to be able to laugh and laugh at, as Jerry says. We don't laugh with, we laugh at, and oh, it's not that. I know. We laugh with, right? See, y'all caught on. I'm glad you did. See, they paid attention when you were here, Jerry. They paid attention. So, but it is good to laugh. If you have your Bibles with you, you might want to turn to the book of Daniel. We're going to study Daniel tonight. We live in a time in which we begin to wonder, where has our decency gone? Where have our morals gone? And we wonder not only from the standpoint of where have they gone, but what can we do? And admittedly, as we think tonight about Daniel, who basically stood up against the king, not just one, three. When you think about Daniel's stand for truth and right, and you look at it and you understand how he did it, you say, but he affected, in essence, three kings, two empires over 70 years. Yeah. I'm just a humble citizen of Davidson County, Nashville Metro. And I don't have political office. I don't rub elbows with political individuals. I don't know a lot of folks. And consequently, what difference can I make? It's sort of like the old story, I think, of the little boy that was walking down the beach one day. And as he was, this man noticed him from afar, and he would bend over, the little boy would bend over, evidently was picking something up, and he would make a motion as if throwing to the ocean. Finally, the old man called up the little boy and says, son, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm picking these starfish up and I'm throwing them back into the ocean. And the beach was just covered with them. And he said, son, he said, well, what difference does that make? Do you think, you're doing any good? And he says, well, it makes a difference to this one. And he threw another one. And it makes a difference to this one. And he threw another one. We do. And the difference that we make in people's lives starts with the people that we're next to. Starts with the people where we are. That's where we have to start. And so when we look at our society, we say, oh, we've got problems. We've got cities that are running down. We've got kids killing kids. We've got kids making kids. We've got adults that are immoral. We've got immorality that's running rampant and seemingly is that which is more accepted today as being all right. You do your thing, I'll do my thing, and we don't have to worry about each other. And we worry about those things. We see them on the nightly news. Now, you got to remember, in 30 minutes, you see what's the worst going on in our society. I mean, it's actually, if you look down at it, a 30-minute newscast is really about 18 minutes. And you got to remember that if you watch three of the four stations that come out of Nashville news-wise, local news, three of the four have sports. There's one that doesn't, or does part of the time. It's the one I watch, unfortunately. But then you have about 3 minutes of weather, and so you kind of buckle that on down a little bit, and you say, well, okay, maybe 12 minutes, 13 minutes, depending upon the night, of bad news. But that's all they give you. They don't tell you about the lady that, goes out in front of her house and sweeps her sidewalk every week to make sure that children don't fall on the sticks, or the individual that, lets somebody in front of them in line, or the individual that is helping the homeless, or the individual that's doing whatever it is good thing. We don't see those things. But we do and are concerned about morals, because the reality of it is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. And we use that in a very broad sense. Fewer and fewer people are going to church. Fewer and fewer people have morals that are affected by the Bible. They're affected by the Bible and then some. But Daniel lived a life that was far different. Daniel lived a life that was exemplary in many things. Now, it doesn't mean that he was perfect, doesn't mean that he did everything correctly, that he did everything that he should have, but yet he did a lot of good things. And there's some things about Daniel's life, as every once in a while we try to look at just the individuals on Sunday night, that when we look at Daniel, we see a man that stood his ground. We see a man that really did some good and made some difference. Well, how did he do that? Well, first thing, verse 8 of the first chapter, it says that he purposed his life. Remember, go back, and what do you see in the first chapter, you see Nebuchadnezzar, you see king, Babylonian king. What did he want? Well, he wanted about verse 2, you see kind of the story beginning to unfold. He wants men. He wants some young men. He wants some young men that are well trained. They're educated, if you will. They're knowledgeable in certain areas, and he wants to train them. And Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, or evidently, as we know them, Azrael and Mishael, and they are assigned to a eunuch. That is his responsibility to get these men, spend 3 years, give them all the king's delicacies, give them all the king's food, fatten them up, smarten them up, and get them ready to go. And it says Daniel purposed in his heart. Didn't want to eat the king's delicacies, didn't want to drink the king's wine, didn't want to use, if you will, the nutritional restrictions or lack thereof that the king had made for these individuals. And he said, give us 10 days. See how we do. And sure enough, after 10 days, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they looked fine. Matter of fact, they looked better than the others that had been involved in the king's delicacies. But notice that it's a purposed life. It's a life that is given directions. It's a life that is shown the way. A purposed life. A purposed life has directions. What's your plan? What's your plan for tonight? I hope your plan is to stay. If you didn't bring anything, that's all right. There's plenty back there. If there's not, you can eat my plate. It's all right. I want you to stay. But what's your plan for tomorrow? I'm going to get up. I'm going to do this, going to do that, going to do the other. That's your plan. What's your plan for the week? Well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do the other. Right? What about your life? David's life was purposed. He had direction. He knew where he was going. He knew where he was headed. He knew who he was following. In our lives, we understand where we're going and how we're going to get there. We understand where we're going. Our aim, our direction is what? Well, it's heaven. What did Paul say in Philippians chapter 3? He says our citizenship is in heaven. And he says in verse 14 that he pressed towards the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Verse 14. Paul had a direction in life. Paul says, I know where I'm headed. Now, he may have not known every little step that he was fixing to take. He may have not known every little city that he was going to go into. Matter of fact, if you stop and think about it, when he wrote that, where was he? He's in prison, right at the end of the book of Acts. He didn't know where his next step was going to be. Matter of fact, wasn't sure whether he'd get out of jail. But he says, I've got a purpose. I've got a direction. I've got a focus in life. He'd set his mind on things above, not on things of the earth. But he'd set his mind and his direction towards heaven. In our lives, that's what we need is a purpose life. We need to understand where we're headed, but also not only where we're headed, but how we're going to get there. If I were to tell you that every one of you that wants to, we're going to go on vacation. We're going to go the first week of June, and we're going to go to Hawaii. I don't know. I just made it up. Some of you would say, no, got problems. I've already got my vacation planned with family. Don't have enough money to go. Okay. Others of you are going to say, okay, let's go. Brother Paul, you paying? No. I'm hoping to get a group up and be the free one out of the group. Well, then we're going to sit down. We're going to say, okay, where are we going through? What stops are we going to make? How we're going to fly, of course, can't walk there. We're going to leave on what date we're getting back. We go through all the process of planning the whole trip, if you will. Now, we may not plan every minute of every day, but we're going to plan. We have direction, we have purpose, we have direction, though, and we know where we're going, and we know how we're going to get there. In your life, you not only know where you're going, but you know, and you remember in that book of Philippians, Paul said that the old King James says that he was in a strait betwixt two. He says, I'm basically between a rock and a hard place. Having a desire to depart, be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain here in the flesh is more needful of you. Paul says, I'm headed. I know where I'm headed. How is he going to get there? Well, he knew how he was going to get there, because he says to the church of Colossae in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 and 14, that he has delivered us or conveyed us from power of darkness, translators, or conveyed us into the kingdom of his dear Son. He's delivered us from darkness. He's conveyed us into the kingdom of his dear Son. Who's he? Jesus. That's how we're going to get there. A purpose life says, okay, I'm going to heaven, and I know how I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there by Jesus. You see, here's the point. For us as Christians, a purpose life, our life directs others to Jesus Christ. Our life directs others towards the King, the Master, Savior. And so Daniel teaches us live a purposed life. But the second thing that we find out about Daniel is that he lived a life of perseverance. You might say in many ways, first of all, he took a stand in chapter 1, verse 8. And in chapter 1, he keeps standing. He doesn't just, if you will, he doesn't stop. He doesn't say, well, you know, we showed them 10 days, we were the best. And that was it. Daniel lived a life for God. Daniel lived a life for God in as much as that he was willing to take a stand. His life was such that he kept going. He lived his life for God, and he lived his life for God continually. It didn't matter what he faced. In Daniel, the 6th chapter, the king now is Darius. The kingdom is the Medo-Persian kingdom. There are those that want to get rid of Daniel. He's a goody two-shoes. He's such a goody two-shoes that those that want to get rid of him know that he stands on a basis of moral purity that is such, as we'll talk about in just a minute, but is such that there's nothing that they can do that they can hang on him. But, if we find something with regards to his God whom he serves, that's what they're saying, then we got him. Of course, we know the story about the worshiping of basically the king as opposed to worshiping of God. But Daniel 6, verse 10, Daniel said that when he knew that the decrees were signed, and he knew the penalty was what? Thrown in a lion's den. What did he do? Daniel 6, verse 10, that he went up to his chambers and he opened up his windows towards Jerusalem, as was his custom. He didn't stop. The world stopped. Others said, no, we worship the king, if you will. Kind of let me use a little my own terminology. And Daniel said, nope. Daniel faced persecution, and Daniel said, doesn't matter. Daniel faced those that looked at him and said, you need to do what we're doing. And Daniel said, no. I'm living a life for God. Satan's pull at us is constant. This morning we talked, just for a minute or two, we were talking about the faith that Jesus had, and one of the things that we talked about was that he believed that God would take care of him, even in the midst of temptation. Well, here we have Daniel understanding that he needed to live his life in the middle of temptation, because we're all tempted, all of us. There's not a one of us that's sitting here that cannot admit the fact that we haven't been tempted. We all would say, well, yes, we've been tempted. We've been put to the test. Well, how'd you do? How'd you do? Did you give in? Did you justify yourself? Here? No. Or did you stand the test? Satan's pull at the Christian is not just a jerk. It's a slow and gradual process. We know that our health runs down. And a lot of times our health runs down and we don't really realize how bad we feel till the doctor figures out what's wrong with us, helps us in our problem, and all of a sudden we feel better. Why? Because we fixed the problem. We didn't realize how bad we were. Whether it's our eyesight, our heart, our physical health, whatever it is, we got to a point where it was a slow, gradual process of decline. Well, Satan is the same way. Satan works a slow, gradual process on Christian. It's not a jerk. It's not a quick pull. It's slow and gradual process. Wherein the Christian wakes up one day and he realizes that he's in the midst of a pot of boiling water that didn't just start, but has gone through a process of heating up. So Paul would remind us in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13, to stand fast in the faith. He would remind us that we're to be Christians that don't give in to the tricks and the tools and the teachers, as we talked about this morning, of Satan. He reminds us that the Christian race is not a short sprint, but it's a long marathon. Daniel's life was like that. Daniel understood that he was to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith he was called. But he was to continue that walk. We as Christians are reminded of what Paul would write to the church Colossae in Colossians chapter 1, verse 10, that they were to be individuals, that they were to be fruitful in every good work, that they were to be increased in knowledge, be fruitful in every good work. Continue to live your life. Continue to live the Christian life while we're to stand fast in the traditions that we've been taught, as Paul would remind the church at Thessalonica in 2 Thessalonians 2, and Paul would also, in much the same language, remind Timothy. We're reminded, don't give up your faith. Because the world may be going somewhere else, because the world may be going in a different direction, doesn't mean we have to and we must. The Christian race that has begun must be kept up. And while there are passages that remind us of those, as we've just looked at, there are people. I like the story. I talked at NHC this afternoon about the story of Joshua and Caleb, and how that they went out with the other spies and how they came back in. And yet it's noteworthy that while in Numbers chapter 14 especially, where the other 10 spies, it says, made the hearts of the people melt, Joshua and Caleb stood their ground. We can do this, and we can do it with God's help. We're reminded from the life of Daniel as well, not only a purposeful life, but a life of perseverance, but a life of personal purity. Yeah, he didn't want to eat the king's meats. He didn't want to defile himself. He didn't want to defile himself from the standpoint of in Daniel chapter 6, like we already said, he lived such a life that they had to find something wrong with his God and the God he serves instead of him, because they knew he was such a good guy. There's a sense in which he stood, from a moral standpoint, he stood pure. Now, I don't think that is to say, and I don't think we should read into the text, well, Daniel was such a good and upstanding guy that he didn't do anything wrong. That there was no sin in his life, that he was a Sebastian, of individual from the standpoint of just a wonderful guy without sin. No. But what we should understand and what we should remember is that he tried his best to live as pure as he possibly could. While we're to be individuals that do the same. That we are to, as Paul says, to lay hands suddenly on no man, need to be partakers of other man's sins, but keep yourself pure. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22. Our life is to be a life of purity. Now, when we think of that, we sometimes think with regards to sexual immorality. The idea of purity, the Bible goes far beyond that. The Bible talks about purity of speech, purity of actions, purity of morals, and that's what we should understand. We should understand that we are lights to the world. We should understand that we are epistles that folks are reading. We should understand that we are ultimately the salt that influences them as salt influences our food that we eat. We should understand that we're priests that are to offer up spiritual sacrifices to God. That we are the individuals that truly are sons of God, children of God. That we've been adopted by God. You see, we should realize who we are. And in that realizing who we are, we need to realize that we need to live, as the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 18, that we need to live honorably. That we need to live above reproach. We're sometimes, though, sort of like the individual that had a boat, enjoyed going fishing. And he put his boat to attach it to his truck, to the hitch on his truck, and he would go off and he'd go down to the river and he would back it up, of course, and he would get that boat and that boat would just float off. One day, he bought a new boat. He hooked it up to his truck. He was so proud of that new boat. He drove it to the place where he's always been. He backs it up. And as he backs it up, he doesn't understand. He looks back in his mirror and he can't see his boat. He can't see his trailer. He goes back there, his trailer is gone. But he knew he just turned in, and he knew he had the boat with him. And so he wonders what in the world's happened. Some young person there says, well, your boat went off into the river, and I know what the problem is. But let me go take a dive and look. And so he dove in where the boat was and came up, and he's laughing, spitting water both at the same time. And he tells the man, you know what your problem was? And the man says, no. He says, you forgot to unhook the boat from the trailer. And it's now at the bottom right over here. We need to understand that in our lives that there's that point in which we have to separate ourselves from the world. We live the life that is not the life that the world lives, but we understand how important Proverbs 22 verse 1, a good name is to be had than great riches. We understand how important it is to be the ones that stand up and are accounted as righteous. In a world that values seemingly the idea more of following the world instead of standing up, Daniel was willing to take a stand. And so from that, there was Daniel's life that became a positive influence. If you look in Daniel chapter 6 especially, one of the things that's interesting is after Daniel has taken a stand, and after Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, because remember, he still prayed, he violated the king's decree. Do you remember the decree that was made then? The decree all of a sudden was made, well, let's listen to God, and we're going to follow Daniel's God, and we're going to pay homage to Daniel's God. Daniel influenced by his life the people that he came in contact with. Preacher, I'm not going to change the world. I'm one person. Yeah, but you're making a difference. Like that little boy walking down the beach, you're making a difference. To the grandchildren that you talk to and the grandchildren that you love, to your neighbor, to your neighbor's children that you talk to, you're making a difference. You're influencing them, and you're influencing them for good. Your influence is powerful. No man lives to himself, and no man dies to himself. And Daniel's influence touched the lives of people that were around him. Our life needs to be like Daniel's, in that we understand the power of the life that we live. John 21. Jesus is no longer in the midst. What do we do? Where do we go? First, you remember what Peter said? He said, I'm going fishing. And the others said what? Let's go. Let's go. You might say, well, that was a terrible plan. They should have done something different, gone somewhere. You can criticize all you want. The point of the story is to show the power of the influence of the time. We need to be mindful of that in our life. That we touch everyone that we come in contact with. Well, preacher, they're as educated or more educated than I am. They've got as much wisdom as I've got. They're my age. You still touch those folks. Well, preacher, I don't work in the workforce anymore. I'm retired, and therefore my circle of influence is small. It's smaller, yes. It's smaller than what you had when you were at work, but it's still there. As you see, when you walked into the grocery store, and you were polite to someone, they're more than likely going to be polite to someone else. When you're driving down the road and you waved at that guy that let you cut in as a sign of appreciation, he's probably going to do it for somebody else a little later on. Now, you can take the converse of that, the flip of that, and you see the problems that exist. Now, you extrapolate that over many different subjects and many different areas, and you see the problem. Daniel teaches us the power of a good life and the influence that it can have upon others. But then you have to ask yourself, where are we going to get the power to do all this? Where are we going to get the power to accomplish all of this? How are we going to be able to accomplish all this? Well, what did Daniel do in Daniel 6? He prayed. We talked about this morning in talking about Jesus' faith. We talked about him believing that God would hear his prayer and answer his prayer. So we don't have to say a lot more about prayer tonight than what we said this morning, except to be reminded that that's really what got Daniel through, because remember what it says, as was his custom. Preacher, I pray 3 times a day. Good. Can you pray 4? Well, okay. Preacher, I pray for my children. I pray for my family. I pray for the world. I pray for you. Thank you very much. I pray for the elders. I pray for this congregation. I pray for the sick. I pray for the shut-ins. I pray for our political leaders. I pray for our nation. Good. Who are you missing? Preacher, I pray for those that I know that aren't walking their faith. They're not living their life like they should. I pray for those that I know that haven't obeyed the gospel. I prayed for those that they have wandered away from the church. I pray for those that are struggling, though, in their life right now. They're going to church and they're faithful in their attendance, and they're trying to live that Christian life all the way they should, but they're struggling. I pray for them. Good. Who are you missing? Think about it. I'm sure you cover all of those and many more. But let us always be reminded that the power to live our life does not come from us. It comes from God. And while he strengthens us with his might through the inner spirit, we're reminded that our strength does come from the Lord. So, while the psalmist would talk about, I'll lift up my eyes into the hills from whence comes my help comes from the Lord. Where do we find that power? Where do we find that strength? God. What's the avenue wherein we tap into it? It's prayer. No, our world in many ways is not going the way we want it to go. And from a moral standpoint, it seems as if it's a great decline instead of going the way it should towards God. But maybe we can take a page out of Daniel's life and live a life like he lived and touch those that we can touch. Why? Because we can make a difference to this one. And we can make a difference to this one. Make a difference to this one. This evening, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, won't you do so? All together we stand and sing.